Generally speaking, I don't like camping trips. When I think of the top 10 things I want to be doing on a weekend, being stuck in the woods under a tarp doesn't make that list. But I had to go. I had no choice. My mom and stepdad wanted all of us to have some quality time outdoors. Besides, my younger brother was extremely pumped about the idea, but I wasn't. I want to make that clear from the start. I didn't want to go camping. I would have loved nothing better than to stay home that night, but it really wasn't my decision to make. We got ready, and my stepdad Jeff packed all the supplies into his truck. The camping site was just a few miles from our town, so I wasn't scared. Of course, we'd heard stories of coyotes and foxes, but it wasn't something that seemed like a clear and present danger to me. We were ready to leave by noon, and as I said, my younger brother Paul was extremely pumped. I wasn't surprised. He's an outdoors kind of guy. I sensed that my mom wasn't entirely into the whole camping thing, but she didn't like opposing Jeff when he came up with his wild ideas. She didn't like making him angry. I, on the other hand, couldn't care less. I sulked throughout the whole trip. We got to the campsite around 2 p.m. in the afternoon, and we began to set up. There was no cell phone network, so my phone was pretty useless. I was listless, so I lazed about, thinking about the great times before now. Paul, though, was full of boundless energy. He ran about helping set up our tent. He made a fire, and he generally did enough for Jeff not to notice me at all. After a while, dusk came, and he got a fire going. Once we got a fire going, my mood improved. I started to get interested in what Jeff and Paul were doing. My mom remained distant, but Jeff wasn't the most aware guy in the world. Then, we heard some movement in the woods right ahead. It was a bit surprising since we hadn't heard any movement before. We'd heard no howling, no movement, nothing. Jeff was a bit startled, but Paul wasn't. "It's probably a deer or something," he said. "Or it may even be a coyote." He looked at Jeff and smiled. "Why don't we hunt it?" he asked. His smile was contagious, and you'd never have guessed that he just suggested something as dangerous as hunting a wild animal. Jeff had a shotgun and had some experience with hunting animals. At least, that's what he often said. He nodded affirmatively and said, "Yes, let's hunt the coyote, or whatever's hiding there." My mom looked slightly alarmed, but she didn't like making Jeff angry, so she just said, "Be careful, you two." I wanted to protest, but Paul was already remarkably invested in the idea of shooting an animal. Within minutes, Jeff had packed his gun and a powerful torchlight. He took Paul's hand and they headed into the woods, far away from the fire, the camp, and their family. For the next hour, we heard nothing, and I started to get worried. My mom looked worried too. "How long does it take to hunt a coyote?" she asked. "How would I know?" I replied, visibly pissed off. I didn't like the woods one bit, but I knew I had to go look for them. I took a torchlight, we had several, and went the way Jeff and Paul went. I wasn't scared of losing sight of the camp. After a few minutes of trekking, I heard a few steps and I saw the powerful light from Jeff's and Paul's torch. They were laughing when they saw me. "I knew you'd start getting worried," said Paul playfully. We headed back to the site. They had found nothing. No deer, no coyote, nothing. It had been a fruitless adventure. When we got to the campsite, something had changed. Someone, something, or a group of things had vandalized our camp. My mom was nowhere to be found, and her favorite shawl was on the floor. Paul's eyes saw red, and I almost couldn't stand. What could have happened to my mom? Who destroyed the campsite? What was happening? Jeff looked incredibly perplexed, and for the first time, found out that our site didn't have cellular coverage. Then we heard someone's voice shouting in the distance. It sounded like my mom. The person was screaming for help at the top of their lungs, but the scream was so faint. Paul, Jeff, and I immediately started running toward the voice, but the more we ran, the fainter the voice seemed to be. We ran for almost 30 minutes in the woods before coming to a fairly large clearing. My mom was lying in the middle of the clearing, unconscious. At last, I got cellular coverage and called the police. Unfortunately, I couldn't describe where I was to them. We'd gotten lost from all that running. But in the meantime, everything seemed to have cooled off. We'd found my mother, my brother, and Jeff had guns, and we had cell phone coverage. It was a terrible night, but it hadn't ended in the worst way. When I was 15, I had a dog. His name was Summer, and he was the best dog that anyone could hope for. He was smart, he was well-behaved, and head always filled with boundless energy. I loved Summer to pieces. He was given to me when I was 13 as a birthday gift, so I'd already known him for 2 years. We were very close, and he was my best friend. But one day, something terrible happened. My Uncle Sam had forgotten to lock the door, and Summer had bounced out of the house. We waited for him to come back, but he didn't. We waited for 2 days, and then decided to start printing posters of Summer and sharing them in the community. We even put a cash reward of $100. We did that for about 3 months, but Summer didn't turn up. It was perhaps the most heartbreaking 3 months of my life. My grades suffered, and I was always drained of emotional energy. But I never gave up. I still hoped that one day Summer would return to my arms. And he did. After 6 months, I was sitting on my porch in my house when I heard a familiar bark. I couldn't believe it. So I stood up to look into the street. Where could this bark be coming from? Shockingly, it was from Summer, as I'd suspected. He was sitting obediently in the street like he was waiting for an invitation to come in. I hugged him, ruffled his head, and carried him inside. I noticed that he didn't smell quite right, but I figured that was expected. Who knows what he'd been eating for the last 6 months? Who knows where he'd been sleeping? No one, really. Another thing I noticed is that his snow-white fur was now much darker. But I didn't care, really. Summer was back, and everything was right with the world. And then, that night, it started. I'd fed Summer like I always did, and allowed him to sleep in my room. Around 2 a.m., I was woken up by his ferocious barks. He was looking out through the window and barking and barking. I thought someone was downstairs, and so did my dad. He grabbed a baseball bat and went down. He searched and searched, but we saw no one. Meanwhile, Summer had stopped barking. I went up to my room, only to discover that all of my clothes were in tatters. My dog had gone through my wardrobe while I was downstairs and had used his teeth to design my clothes. I was a bit cross, but they were just clothes. I went back to sleep. The next night, the same thing happened, but this time, it was with a twist. While my dad and I searched the grounds for a trespasser, a flower pot came crashing down from my room's window. If my dad had not moved away a few seconds before, the pot would have crashed onto his head. At my window was Summer, smiling a smile that drove fear into my lungs. This time, I was properly crossed. I drove him out of my room and slept alone for the remainder of the night. On the third night, I had a change of heart and allowed Summer to sleep in my room again. By 2 a.m, like clockwork, he started barking again. But this time, Summer was not barking at the window. This time, he was barking at the mirror. It was a much more frenzied bark than before, and I was scared. I tried to usher Summer out of my room, but that's when something that's never happened before happened. He bit on my hand so badly that I felt my skin break. My dad heard my screams and was at my door, but since the door was locked, there was nothing he could do. Summer attacked me like a thief. He bit at my hands and arms and attacked my face. For a dog with such a tiny posture, he packed a lot of power. Within seconds, I was on the ground begging for my life. My father finally got away to break open the door, and as he entered the room, Summer got off me. He went directly through my window, glass and all, and landed with a thud. I was certain that he was dead, but when I went to look out the window, I could see nothing. The next morning, we searched everywhere for Summer, but we found nothing. We've not seen him till this day. When we moved into our new house, I was beyond happy. Our old house was pretty small and was in an undesirable neighborhood, but this one was a dream house. I didn't have to share a room with my brother, and we had a backyard where my dad could make barbecues. We even had a small pool. Let's just say it was a great house. When we moved in, everything seemed great. It was amazing, everyone was happy. However, something happened during the first night. I was woken up by a strange noise around midnight. It was a scratching sound, like as if someone was scratching at the other side of my bedroom door. I was startled, but I woke up to investigate the source of the scratching. At most, it would be a rat or a cat. I wasn't scared of all those. So I opened my door, and to my surprise, I saw nothing. I went downstairs to investigate further and saw my dad standing in the middle of the room with a baseball bat. He looked like he'd been pursuing something or someone for a while. He asked me if I'd heard the scratching sound too. I said yes. He said that I should go back to bed, that he'd keep watch. Nothing else happened that night. The next night, it wasn't a scratching sound. It was a thudding sound, and it was heard loudly throughout the whole house. It was as if someone was banging on the walls outside the house. This time, my brother, dad, and I came out, but immediately we were outside the doors. Something eerie had happened. It was as if the thudding just stopped. In the tension of that moment, a scream pierced the air. It was my mom, and the door got shut behind us. Someone had locked us out. It was a frenzy, and before we knew it, we were trying to break into our own house. My mom continued to scream, and we continued to bang on the doors. The windows were made of reinforced glass, so it took more than a few hits from my dad's baseball bat for even a dent to be made. Throughout that time, my mom continued to scream. It seemed she was in mortal danger. Seeing that my dad was having no luck with the glass, I decided to climb up to my room, where I'd hopefully be able to gain access to the house through my open window. Luckily for me, I was able to climb successfully and get into my room. But upon getting there, I discovered that my door was locked. That was very surprising because I didn't remember locking my door after leaving my room. In the meantime, I heard scuffles coming from down the hall. It seemed my mom was fighting with someone or something. I couldn't wait to find out, so I put all of my weight into the door, but still it refused to budge. Downstairs, I could hear glass breaking. It seemed my dad was successful in breaking down the windows. He got in, and I could immediately hear steps leaving my parents' room. That's when I leaned into my bedroom door with all of my strength. I'm pretty big, and the door was not particularly strong, so the lock gave way. As I entered the hallway, I could see the silhouette of a man leaving my parents' room and running downstairs. Thankfully, my dad caught up with the man and tackled him to the ground. We called the police, and soon there was a unit around to pick him up. We later heard that he was a homeless man with a mental illness who used to sleep in the house before we bought it. He did nothing to my mom, and he only tried to wrestle her off the bed so he could sleep. But till this day, my father, brother, and I sleep with baseball bats near our beds.